Now it's time for today's perspective. And last week saw more severe violence in Kenya. The government there admits that 10 people, Amnesty says 16 people, were killed with around 400 others injured. The violence came on what was the first anniversary of the wave of other deadly anti-government demonstrations that hit the nation in 2024, largely against large tax increases. The protests in 2024 against the President William Ruto killed between 10 and 22 people. Joining us now is Irungu Houghton, who's Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya. Thanks very much for being with us on the programme. First of all, let's talk about what happened last week. The government says 10 people killed. You say it was 16. What evidence does Amnesty have about what happened in those protests last week?
I'd like to actually, sadly, revise those figures upwards. We now know from the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights that 19 people have been verified to have been killed, primarily from gunshot wounds, which of course is the preserve of the National Police Service. So these are essentially cases we're treating as police killings. There's potentially another 2 people that are being verified in the course of today. They're not more. It's not 400 people that got injured, but we're actually looking at 500 and above cases of people who were injured in Wednesday's protests.
And how do you collect and prove, if you like, that evidence?
Well, very sadly, and it's one of the saddest parts of our work as Amnesty International. It is to the it is to the mortuaries that we turn. It is to the hospitals that we turn, and that's where the verification is done. In many cases, we also have many cases of eyewitnesses. One of the most, most modern forms of following this process is through smartphones. Many of these cases are actually filmed by citizens, and we're able to follow up using that information. So eyewitness accounts and medical and mortuary records is what we follow up on. This means that there may be other cases that have yet to being taken to mortuaries, but that's how we do our verification. So we're fairly clear that the numbers of 19 dead and over 500 injuries is accurate.
Tell us more about what people are actually protesting about.
Well, Wednesday's protests were called essentially to commemorate the first anniversary of the 2024 25th of June protests. And those, of course, as you've mentioned, were related to the concerns around a finance bill that many felt had punitive taxes. And this was essentially what happened a year ago. Since that point, 65 people have died over the year, and about 89 cases of enforced disappearances have happened, primarily of people who have been agitating and dissenting against government policy. Essentially, what's happened in Kenya over the last year has been the development of a very useful accountability movement. They call it the Gen Z movement, and they have been very concerned about the cost of living, the lack of economic and social opportunities, the deteriorating health and education services, and also police brutality. These have been the major issues. So this last Wednesday's protest was essentially called for accountability and justice for all those people who have died. And the protest was actually kicked off by the mother of the first protester to have died, Rex Masai. And essentially, unfortunately, rather than a somber, reflective, and caring set of demonstrations, what we saw was even more violence.
So do you think then that the crackdown by the authorities is becoming more oppressive and presumably the government becoming more authoritarian?
We have deep concerns with the repressive policing that's taking place. There is also a new concern, which is the introduction of violent instigators and paid goons, as they're called in the Kenyan context. So the protests become extremely violent. Not just as a result of policing that is violent, but also as a result of large crowds of people who are brought into protests essentially to turn them more violent and to use the opportunity to loot. As you can see, many businesses lost billions of shillings of property during the protests. And I think the concern that Amnesty has is that, while we have the right, a constitutional right to assemble and to non-violently, peacefully articulate our concerns with governance, it is really important that this also is protected by the National Police Service. And it should be mentioned that the European Union, among many other governments, spoke out with concern about the level of violence last week.
Yeah, I mean, the government has praised the security forces, hasn't it, for what it says was restraint amid extreme provocation, crediting them even with helping to foil an attempted coup.
Yeah, we would. So there are moments in the protest last week. The first 4 hours were moments where we did see police restraint in Mombasa, for example. There was a real attempt to work with the marshals of the protesters, and there was absolutely no signs of the kind of violence that we saw in Nairobi, in Mombasa. Many other counties, I think about 29 counties out of 47, had protests. So this is a national phenomenon. Many of those counties had very peaceful protests, but the problem comes when the police begin to disrupt the protesters. So in the case of Nairobi, the site of Rex Masai's mother, the late protester, a former chief justice, and a senator, among others, being tear gassed and shot at, was a major concern for us. Much of the protests remain, non-violent until either there is violent, actions against the police, or we see these large groups of people who are brought in essentially to disrupt the protests by politicians.
Irungu Houghton, thanks very much for joining us on the programme there. Irungu Houghton is the Executive Director of Amnesty International, joining us there from Nairobi. Thanks very much.